Welcome everyone to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator today. And welcome to the latest in our series of deep dive events, in which we invite panels of experts, as you know, to discuss topics of current interest, followed by a Q&A session among all members and attendees and also guests. Okay, well, today is the second of our sessions on the subject of Japan as the man in the middle between US-China, of US-China economic rivalry. And briefly, what we're going to be looking at is whether Japan can avoid taking sides while pursuing its own regional and international economic interests in Asia and in the world. And to discuss this very, very topical subject, we've got two eminent experts in the person of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He was joining us via Zoom. Welcome, Professor Calder. And here in person on my left, we have Jesper Koll, who's a very well-known face for most of us. What I think less people know is that Jesper studied in Johns Hopkins University and indeed obtained a master's degree in international relations at the School of Advanced International Studies there. So he's well known to Professor Calder and vice versa. Okay, well, I'd like to invite Professor Calder to speak first. Both panelists will speak for 20 minutes approximately, maximum 30 minutes. But a few more words first about Professor Calder. As I said, he's director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He previously served as Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and International Research Corporation and Director of Asia Programs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. And he served continuously as a Director of the Reischauer Center and is a Reischauer Professor of East Asian Studies since 2003. Before arriving at Johns Hopkins, Professor Calder served as a special advisor to the US ambassador to Japan. He was Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Professor at Princeton University, Lecturer on Government at Harvard, and also he served as the first Executive Director of Harvard University's Program on US-Japan Relations. Okay, well, I'll introduce Jesper in more detail later, but Professor Calder, if you could set the ball rolling, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a real honor to participate in a session this way at the FCCJ. I have to say I've spoken a number of times in person, and I have a lot of affection for your bar and your restaurant and just hanging out with journalists and friends, so many of them at the press club. So I'm awfully sorry that I'm not there in person. We're speaking, I think, at an extremely interesting time, just as the Kishida government begins. I'll go more into why I think it's especially interesting, but even the fact that we've seen a postponement in the selection of a successor to Foreign Minister Motegi for another week, and the potentially rather contrasting possibilities as foreign minister, which could bear on the dilemmas that I think Japan faces in this extremely treacherous triangular relationship among Japan, China, and the United States.
And could you possibly speak a little closer to the microphone, please?
Can you hear me? Can you hear
me
better?
Yes, that's better. Good.
Okay, surely. Thank you. Triangles, of course, are always difficult. We know that from human nature. Love triangles, friendship triangles, all sorts of complexities that come out of three parties in a relationship. And this is no exception. There, of course, looking across history, there have been sometimes when it went extremely well. If you take, for example, the decade 1979, after the United States recognized Beijing, just as China did in 1972, up until Tiananmen Square in 1989. Of course, it was really rather stable, peaceful. They were partners in the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union, which of course made things relatively easy for Japan. Ezra Vogel characterized that, of course, as the golden age of U.S. China-Japan relations. Um, since then, of course, the pattern has become much more complex. I've written, as I think most of you know, I've written quite broadly about East Asian political economy. Do we have, it looks like, we have quite a complex pattern since then. I did a piece that some of you know called Japan and China's Simmering Rivalry.
Sorry, you've frozen, I think.
I was muted. Apparently, it says you are muted. I didn't mute myself. Am I muted now? Can you hear
No,
me?
you're okay now. We can hear you again. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. I think we might have had an interruption, it
Okay.
sounds like. But as I was saying before, I've worked particularly on Japanese politics, of course, but more broadly, of course, on the evolution of regionalism across Eurasia, including some of the recent work, my supercontinent book, that goes far beyond Japan-China relations. But on Japan-China, I did a piece in 2006 called China and Japan's Simmering Rivalry. At that point, that was what I was characterizing it. It wasn't the golden age that had prevailed from 79 to 89 particularly. And, then, but it's been becoming more and more complex. And I think it's fair to say that particularly in the past decade, it's become, since perhaps around 2010, slightly before the Abe administration came in, but the interaction of the Abe administration and President Xi's administration in China has assumed a certain realistic competition, and of course tensions have risen. There's been many factors behind that. Obviously, China's rise, its rising economic scale, its rising importance as a market, which of course makes it more attractive for not only Japan, but for nations around the world. China's become the largest trading partner of almost all of the major advanced nations. But although some nations, for example, Korea, have become much more dependent on China than Japan has. Also, there's been, of course, in the past 10 years, more assertive Chinese policies in a variety of areas. I think there's no question. I'm sure that will come back in further discussions. And then, of course, beneath a lot of this, there are unresolved territorial and legitimacy issues. The senkakus, the territorial issues are right around Japan that John Foster Dulles didn't resolve through the peace treaty in San Francisco, that have continued to complicate Japan's foreign policy, but particularly with China. And then, of course, the issue of Chinese reunification. Now, those are some of the challenges. Maybe I should add to that rapid pace of technological change in some areas, the rising interrelationship of defense industry and technology and electronics, mainly electronics, but software for commercial civilian use as well. The intermingling of those things has complicated the relations among these countries and caused it to take on a more confrontational task. Now, the subject of our discussion, as I understand it, more than the things that are challenging, that are driving, that are making life more difficult for this triangle, the question is what Japan's response has been to Japan, China, particularly, but to the triangular relationship. And then how, particularly under the Kishida government, but of course the issues go far beyond that, what it is likely to be going forward. There's three dimensions, it seems to me, of China's relationship with, or rather, I'm sorry, Japan's relationship with nations with whom it has delicate confrontational ties that are somewhat different from the stance of the United States, that have really continued ever since the days of friendly trading companies and in the 1950s. First of all, avoiding conflict as much as possible with all of the key parties. It was Yuko Gaisha, friendship companies, of course, who did stage in some areas relatively extensive trade with China for significant periods, even before China or Japan-China normalized in 1972. But it was through a different set of companies and networks from those that were dealing with the United States. And the same thing also was true in the political world and the cultural world. A group of specialized contacts that Japan used really quite effectively in many ways to open a dialogue with China that didn't complicate too extensively the relationships with Washington. Also, opposition parties. The Komeito at a certain point in time, of course, played an important role in the opening of ties between China and Japan in 1972, just to cite one example. So avoiding conflict with all key parties, fractionalizing the problem, and making it a question of comity, dialogue, friendly relations with the various parties and different groups being delegated to those sort of functions. But then the government, particularly keeping a more holistic view and watching all of these players as they went about handling what was a rather complicated relationship. More so, of course, before 1972 than any other time. But I would argue we see certain aspects even of that pattern today, even within corporations, within trading companies, within, either government ministries or more than that, also Gaikaku Dantai, various sort of associated organizations that ministries or corporations might have to be handling these kind of complicated problems. Another, and forgive me as a sort of a political aficionado from getting so deeply into the structural side, there is a point that I am intending to make from all of this, which is basically that I think the difficulties in taking really decisive action for Japan are very difficult, but the bias will be toward moderation, toward balancing, and that for a variety of reasons that will continue. Now, you might, many of you know that I did a piece some years ago for World Politics called Japan as a Reactive State in Foreign Policy. Some people say Japan is no longer a reactive state, that it has a very decisive foreign policy, and they, will take, say, the emergence of Indo-Pacific policy under Prime Minister Abe or the CPTPP after the President Trump pulled out as examples. And I think those are evidence of some significant change in Japanese capabilities. I would take that point. And certainly the Conte has grown in size. It's become more sophisticated. The relationships between some key ministries and the Conte have certainly deepened. And where we've had decisive leadership, it's led to something that modifies that reactive bias of Japanese policy. But it's certainly, that is not the exclusive pattern. And the both this traditional approach of trying to have contacts to all sides, also structural problems like a fragmented bureaucracy, like factionalism inside the LDP, which again is less important than it was, say, a decade ago because of the electoral changes, but it has not disappeared. Japan is not the United States. It's not France. It's not, Korea, all of the presidential system countries. The Japanese system has not, in my view, transformed itself that remarkably. That said, of course, the case of many of the things Prime Minister Abe did, particularly, they stand out. Not only Prime Minister Abe, but for being more decisive than in the past. Even Prime Minister Abe had areas where he needed to be reactive. Some aspects of his policies to the Trump administration. Just think of when the transition to Trump, he was relatively subtle in dealing with that, but also very active and quite deferential on many important points to President Trump. Um, so I don't think the reactive state is dead. Now, relating all of that to China itself, uh, I think what certainly makes sense for all the three parties in this triangle is to try to stay closer to each of the two parties than they are to each other, just as common sense. And fortunately for Japan, since the two countries, China and the US, are not getting along very well, that's not so difficult to do. But of course, on the specifics, on what sort of proactive steps Japan might take, of course, I think that becomes a much more difficult question where it has to read the tea leaves that are emerging from both of these two countries. Broadly, and I'm sure we would have a discussion on this, my sense is that the Anchorage meetings between the US and China were something of a low point, if you, in the sense of a confrontation, that it's not that the United States is deferring to China. And of course, in the face of the situation in the Taiwan Straits and so on, that the United States really can't afford to back away. But that said, um, impressionistically from here in Washington, um, and President Biden has and Secretary Blinken, have said this, that there are certainly important areas for cooperation between the U.S. and China. The meetings, Blinken's meetings in Europe in the last few days, and the Europeans, of course, I think are a bit nervous about a deepening confrontation as well. We might have seen, if the Chinese also pull back from the rather aggressive policies that they've been taking in the Taiwan Straits, the situation might well be more stable in going forward. And I'm sure that'll be a question of discussion. That brings me to what we should make of Prime Minister Kishida's China policies. Of course, he comes from the Kochikai. It was once the whole tradition of Yoshida Gaiko. Prime Minister Ohira, for example, Prime Minister Ikeda, Prime Minister Ohira, who was actually Tanaka Kakue's foreign minister, when China and Japan normalized in 1972. Their tradition has been, or rather dovish, if you want to put it that way. It's also the largest faction in the LDP. So that sort of, I wouldn't, dovish is too strong on security, but it's been, in terms of priorities, the economic side being more prominent. So it's interesting that during the campaign, Prime Minister Kishida, shifted toward a more assertive stance on missile defense. Of course, he was foreign minister during the North Korean missile tests, which I'm sure must be vividly in his mind as he thinks forward. So North Korea is a serious defense concern. He can't avoid thinking about that. Naval defense. He's stressed those things. It's been, to my mind, something of a shift from where certainly his faction and even he personally has, generally speaking, been. He did speak after the election, I believe, with President Xi Jinping. But then he stressed maritime issues, Hong Kong, a range of awkward subjects. But he was in contact with China. So, and he retained, of course, Defense Minister Kishida, which I think is important, the brother of Prime Minister Abe. So I think a lot is really going to turn on the situation relating to Taiwan. If that continues to intensify, then Japan, certainly the United States, would press Japan to collaborate in certain more active forms of pressure to inhibit the Chinese. But and it's hard to say how that will go. I think maybe that should be left for discussion. Let me say just a few things in conclusion. First of all, I guess I see generally the Kishida government as a balancer, a base that is moderate domestically, that's oriented toward economic matters, that would like to deepen economic ties with China, or at least stabilize, let's say stabilize those, if again, the political issues were not so complex that they inhibited that. The former Secretary General Nikai, of course, is out of the political equation, which I think is probably important. That's a bit of an inhibitor on a more hawkish strategy toward China. But there are important conciliators, it seems to me, in the woodwork. Also, another question, as I say, it's very interesting now, is the question of the new foreign minister that has been deferred from when at least I anticipated that it would be, which I suppose is an indication that, not surprisingly, there's some degree of conflict regarding that issue that mirrors this ambivalence and the complexity of managing China for Japan. Some people and two defense ministers, it seems to me, are particularly interesting in this regard. They both have strong records on defense. Yogi Hayashi, or Hayashi Yoshimasa, for example, and then former Defense Minister Onodera, whom both, of course, have served as defense ministers. Onodera for Prime Minister Abe, and Hayashi previously. And of course, Hayashi being from Yamaguchi-ken and having been in the upper house for many years, despite hoping to run in the lower house, partly during the Abe prime ministership, is now in a different situation. And so for Prime Minister Kishida, that would be an interesting act of independence if he ended up picking Hayashi as foreign minister. But then again, Onodera had a strong record of defense, but it was closer to the Abe line. So there's some major ambivalences, it seems to me, that we can see, but precisely because Japan still has many characteristics of a reactive state, particularly when you don't have a long-lived, proactive, very proactive prime minister the way Prime Minister Abe was, then these reactive traits show up, and the way that Japan will move between these two great powers will be influenced by the nature of the crises that we face going forward. Now, there's a lot left to go, I know, but I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. All right, we'll turn to Jesper. Let me just briefly say again that Jesper obtained a master's degree in international relations at Johns Hopkins University SAIS, and worked from 1985 as a research fellow at the University of Tokyo and the University of Kyoto before beginning his career in finance. He served as managing director and chief economist for two major US investment banks, JP Morgan Japan Securities and Merrill Lynch Japan Securities. He's also an expert director at the Japan-based Monex Group, an investment committee member of the Japan Catalyst Fund, and he also serves on the board of directors of the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, OIST. So, Jesper, please.
Thank you very much. And Professor Calder, thank you so much. I must say I'm absolutely honored to be on a panel with you. I think technically I am still a PhD student at SAIS.
Is that right?
It used to have great
You've already graduated long ago from all degrees, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I unfortunately never, had the discipline to actually complete the whole PhD. But I can tell you, having that student pass, gets me, the cheap tickets into cinemas and theaters. So, it used to work out wonderful. It really is an honor. It's obviously a huge topic here, and I really like, Professor Calder's, framing, of what the issues are. And I think this concept of Japan as a reactive state, I think is something that you can get a lot of mileage on in order to frame the discussion. Now, I want to counter that in the sense that we'll discuss whether the state is reactive. But I can tell you that in the world of business, in the world of finance, in the world of economics, Japan is not reactive, but the private sector is incredibly proactive. If you look at the degree of globalization, the degree of global diversification of the production map and the customer map, there's nobody who does this better than Japan. And let me give you some specific data on this. You find that of the listed companies, so, not the small and medium-sized mom and pop shops, but the companies that you invest in, of the 4,000 or so listed companies, you find that about 63% of the profits comes from actually producing or selling to the rest of the world. And that has actually increased steadily year by year by year. A decade ago, before Abenomics, it was about 50%. Now it's 63%. So the overall global footprint of Japan is absolutely spectacular. And in the world of finance, it's always said, oh, finance is dominated by the Americans. It is not. In Asia Pacific, outside of China, Japanese banks have been the largest creditor for the last 4 years by a very, very wide margin. it's very, very interesting, right, that everybody wants to focus on, for example, the Chinese public sector, the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of providing debt finance. But the reality is that when you look at Indonesia, when you look at India, when you look at the ASEAN countries, it is the Japanese mega banks. It is the Japanese Development Bank. It is the what used to be the Japan Export-Import Bank, right, that actually provide a lot of the credit. And what's very interesting, that credit 10, 15 years ago was predominantly to Japanese affiliates. Over the last 10 years, it has actually diversified into local corporations. So my number one message at the outset, make no mistake, Japan's private sector is not reactive, it is incredibly proactive. Now, this proactiveness, right, has actually also, changed the overall dynamics. So, for example, I mentioned that about 63% of the earnings for listed companies comes from overseas, from global operations or exports. You find that the composition of what is earned from the rest of the world has actually changed dramatically. 10 years ago, it was literally half of the overseas earnings came from the United States of America. This has now been diversified. The latest data suggests that it's about a quarter of the overseas earnings come from the United States of America, down from 50%, while, of course, China has increased from about 8% 10 years ago to about 23%, and non-China Asia has also risen, to about 23, 24%. So today, when we are talking about Japan, can it be the man in the middle between US and China? Well, from my economist hat, you actually find that Japan, well, the private sector, 25%, give or take, a quarter of your earnings comes from the US, a quarter comes from China, a quarter comes from the rest of Asia. Wow. That's a very, very powerful position to actually be in terms of you have not chosen sides, you have actually proactively created a stable triangle, right, in terms of the economic diversification that has come from that. I think that we can take this further. When I started out, when Johns Hopkins University, when SAIS shipped me over to Japan in the mid-1980s, there was a lot of criticism at the time that Japan just uses checkbook diplomacy, right? Japan didn't really have any friends, didn't really have any allies. Well, things have changed. 1 in 5 factory workers in Thailand works for a Japanese corporation. I mean, this is incredible in terms of, the goodwill that has actually been brought by Japan's private sector investments in Asia Pacific. And as a result of that, the opportunities, the job creation of an entire generation, right, is fully ingrained, is fully, connected, to Japan. And so the bottom line is, when I arrived in Japan 35 years ago or something, basically Japan, for all intents and purposes, did not really have any friends in Asia Pacific. Well, I think it's fair to say that today, Japan actually does have genuine friends. And it's not just the anti-China coalition. It is actually the fact that corporate Japan has actually built goodwill, has done proper technology transfer. Lots of Japanese companies have very extensive training and internship and scholarship programs to actually educate, young Asians. And that is something, that you should not forget. It's not just cool Japan, it's not just Pokemon and Super Mario. It is actually the fact that you've got real middle-class jobs that have been created, by corporate Japan here in Asia Pacific. Now, the second thing is that this the private sector economic integration, which is very, very deep, right, obviously also goes into the People's Republic of China. I always have to point out that China is Japan's largest trade partner on both exports and imports. And that's incredible, right? On both exports and imports. It's very, very integrated. Japan and China, for all intents and purposes, are economies that are linked at the hip. And it is interesting that about 2/3 of the imports from the People's Republic of China is what economists call captured imports. So these are products from joint ventures or Japanese, joint ventures with Chinese corporations that are being imported back into Japan, both final products as well as intermediate products. Now, the interesting thing is, and I'd love to hear Professor Calder's response to that, is that sure, right now we all want to talk about the new Cold War and all these wonderful things, or not the wonderful, these scary things, that are happening. Well, there's a lot of good things that have happened. For example, people forget that just last year, we got RCEP. Right, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, right, which is, please, can we remember, the largest free trade agreement, a multilateral free trade agreement that we've got in the world. It covers basically 1/3 of the global population and 1/3 of GDP. I know that India in the last minute did not join, but hey, the People's Republic of China did join. And in fact, when you look at trade and what, as these tariffs are coming down, it is actually the Japan-China trade relationship where the impact of the free trade agreement RCEP is actually the largest, right? Very, very important. For about 70% of the imports from the People's Republic of China, you will see very sharp tariff reductions, right, coming through here, which is, by the way, as an aside, one reason why Japan at the moment does not have inflation, while a lot of the rest of the world actually does have inflation. But let's leave that aside here. So the point I try to make here is that, again, this proactive nature of the private sector over the last 30 years has actually been followed up by the government, right? And I would use RCEP as one example. And of course, what used to be called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? And now it's got an acronym that I can't ever pronounce.
CPTPP.
Yeah, this for German, CPTPP is very difficult
and for English
to
too.
pronounce. Anyway, I think the point I'm trying to make is very clear. I think, just one other example, where Japan, certainly has been very, very proactive, and people always forget, is that Japan, in terms of economic as well as diplomatic, relations, absolutely dominates the relationship with Indonesia, right? As you know, for example, if you look at, the Indonesian car market, if you look at the Indonesian scooter market, 90% of this is Japanese companies. And both the economic and the political and diplomatic integration between Japan and Indonesia obviously is a very, very strong one, right? And I think that people should not forget about that. Finally, I think that, one issue that I think Japan faces is that, yes, obviously the United States dominates the actual setting of the agenda. And what Japan lacks is ultimately a little bit of marketing, a little bit of promoting the efforts that Japanese diplomats, that Japanese industrial policymakers are actually conducting. And it was very interesting, when you look, for example, at Quad, right? The relationship between, the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, right? Which, ultimately, the origins came, and Professor, correct me if I'm wrong, came from Prime Minister Abe, right? Mm-hmm. And it was originally focused on, at the foreign policy level. But once America got going, once you had a president that actually was ready to build alliances, it was actually turbocharged in a way that the Japanese would never have been able to do. Right, and it was very interesting. I had, and this is, as an aside, in the early months of the Biden administration, I had the good fortune of being invited to a session with some of the White House people, dealing with Asia Pacific, and we talked a little bit about Quad, right, and Japan's role. And the gentleman who shall remain unnamed, basically said, well, the Japanese do all the right things, but they've got to learn that foreign policy is not just about reading prepared statements with a smile. Sometimes you actually have to ruffle some feathers, which is quite interesting, which is, again, the role of a mediator. All the positions in terms of the economic integration are in place, but it is a subtle leadership rather than an outspoken leadership. And the outspokenness always will come from the United States of America. Let me perhaps stop here and open it up for questions and for discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, especially your interesting points on the RCEP and TPP. But do we have any questions from the floor to begin with? Questions online. Saito-san, do we have questions online? I would like to start off maybe the question to both Professor Calder and Jesper, which is, Jesper, you used the phrase, you have created a stable triangle, but is it really stable? I mean, it was stable, but it's based largely on a kind of hypocrisy that you could be not exactly enemies, but you could have your differences at the government-to-government level, but the business level, things have been going along swimmingly. But, given the rise in tensions, given the change in Japanese governments, possibly change in policies, can this stable triangle continue, or will the non-economic factors begin to become more intrusive and actually interfere with things like, for instance, long-term Japanese investment in China, which after all is a long-term perspective? Professor Calder first, do you have a view on that?
Yes, to some extent I share your skepticism. I should say that I think Jesper makes an important point about the role of the private sector. Across my work as well, I've often thought of this dualism that the government might be cautious, reactive, playing to a whole series of different audiences, as we've said, and faced by political pressures, which allowed the private sector, and of course, it had Japan's private sector has had some remarkable strengths that you point to, and those things have allowed it to play major roles, especially in places like Southeast Asia. So, I would agree with that point, but I'm a little more guarded about the issue of the stable triangle, particularly if we consider the way that it's embedded in what is essentially a Cold War structure of international relations that really dates from the 1950s. And in a world where technology, commercial and defense technologies are coming closer to one another. For example, if we take artificial intelligence, 5G is another example of that trend. The whole question of Huawei's involvement in Japan, and there were groups like SoftBank and so on that had relatively close ties, that there was a lot of pressures on that and a lot of difficulty and I would say controversy. Now, those could just be flashes in the pan, but patterns of trade are changing. Also, the relationship of Europe and China, on which I would be very interested in Jesper's or our group's positions. It seems to me that the deepening of ties between China and other parts of the continent, both southward to Southeast Asia, Belt and Road is one part of it, and westward across Central Asia, but particularly to the relationship with Europe, preeminently Germany. Chancellor Merkel, of course, visited China 13 times, if I'm not mistaken, as chancellor, significantly more than she came to Japan. Of course, recently Europe has begun shifting its policies back, and Japan has had some remarkable initiatives. And the private sector has been, of course, very important. But what do we make of these the very, very large increase in the scale of the Chinese economy? The fact that China's location is so central, and the fact that China is becoming connective with the rest of the continent and in many parts of the world in new ways that it wasn't before, making its huge scale more and more relevant around the world. What kind of impact does that have on Japan and Japan's role?
Thank you. Jesper, do you want to?
I mean, look. I mean, it's obviously a very dynamic process, and there's absolutely no question, that the dynamics that was a relatively stable equilibrium, over the last generation, shall we say, over the last 30 years, that's being challenged, and it's being challenged both. By the People's Republic of China, as well as, by the reaction, from the United States of America from that. I would argue, however, that from an economic and business and financial perspective, right, this duality that you talk about, right, business doing one thing, the economy is doing one thing, and politics and national security doing another thing, that's obviously a tension that everybody has, right? If you look, for example, at the U.S. technology companies, right, again, about 40% of their earnings, come from, doing stuff with the People's Republic of China, right? So there is a dependence there. And the interesting thing is that actually, despite all this stepping up in the rhetoric, over the last 15, 18 months, the fact that the foreign direct investment flows into the People's Republic of China from both Japan and the United States of America have actually continued to grow. And this is just economics. And the interesting thing is, if you look, for example, Toyota, and I'm just going to use Toyota as an example here, which may not be the right thing since it's such a stellar, exceptional company, but still, it is representative of Japan Inc. To some extent. The profit margin of a Toyota factory in the People's Republic of China is now twice as large as it is in North America. Right, so it's very, very clear where you're going to be going, particularly since the projected growth rates, in that particular market are going to continue, to be increasing very, very much. Now, on the triangle side, right, I actually think that the good news for Japan, is that at the moment the United States of America is very focused on building alliances, right? And these alliances are very manifest in the world of security. I mean, we've got a UK aircraft carrier, right, here in Asia Pacific. We even got a German frigate, that is coming, which surprised all the Germans. They didn't realize that Germans had frigates that actually work. There's a significant amount of underinvestment in the German military, that I think many people are aware of. But I think that, this symbolism, right, is it really a triangle, or is it actually growing into a network? A network of the willing, a network that, yes, is a posture, is symbolic, right? Trying to set limitations on the security and defense threat that we do get, from the People's Republic of China. But it's something where Japan is not the second man in, but it's actually, one of them, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. If I might just briefly, I know there are many questions, but I think that notion that we need to broaden our horizons analytically from simply a small number of interactions inside Northeast Asia between Japan and the countries directly bordering it to a much broader pattern of interaction, of which interactions across Eurasia, including Europe in important ways, are becoming more and more important. I agree very much on that point.
Can I just make one point on that, which is, again, I think, and we shall see whether Abe was really exceptional, or whether he set the new standard, and whether the new Prime Minister Kishida can actually follow this up. I mean, Abe was the first Japanese Prime Minister in a long, long time, who 1 weekend every month went overseas. And 1 weekend every month, he went overseas not just to walk on a red carpet. He actually assembled, right, the business leaders, of the countries that he was visiting, together with the Japanese companies who had business or wanted to do business in that specific country he was visiting, and they had concrete ideas, concrete proposals of what it is that they were trying to sell, so to speak, right? And so this engagement at the super political level, saying, fine, one way to get stability is to create greater linkages between individual countries. And the deeper these linkages are, right, whether they are at the grassroots level in terms of student exchange, whether they are at the business level in terms of new trade agreements and new investment, that is something where Abe put a lot of sweat equity into it. And it would be fantastic, in my personal opinion, to actually see Prime Minister Kishida do exactly the same thing. Work together with your biggest ally in Asia Pacific, which is the Japanese business community, and actually run a fully professionalized business diplomacy.
Interesting point. Okay, we have a question from Professor Masahiro Kawai, who incidentally was a panelist in the first of these sessions. Professor Kawai, as you probably know, was former Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. He was Deputy Vice Finance Minister for International Affairs and all sorts of things. Professor Kawai, can you come online, please?
Okay, thank you very much.
I can't hear you very well. Could you speak a little bit?
Hello, can you
Better,
Hello.
yes.
hear me?
Yes, that's
Okay.
better. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Calder and Mr. Jesper, for your excellent presentations. I very much enjoyed both discussions. Since Professor Calder is an American and Mr. Jesper is a German, I have some questions on US policy and EU policy,
Okay.
particularly in the area of trade policy. My first question is on RCEP and EU-China comprehensive agreement on investment. Now, the US took a very negative view towards the EU-China CAI, while the US did not seem to take a negative view towards RCEP. Both intended to strengthen economic relationship with China. Now, why did the US take different approaches to RCEP and EU-China CAI? My second question is on CPTPP.
Yes, yes.
As an economist, and I tend to think that Mr. Jesper may support my view. Japan should be working with China on CPTPP. If China is truly committed to domestic structural reforms so that China can join CPTPP, although it may take some years to fully be able to join CPTPP, but making efforts towards structural reforms to further open up the economy, SOE reform, state-owned enterprise reform, and labor standard reform, data flow, and data related, in data related areas, reforms can proceed, then it will be good, not only for Japan, EU, but also for the United States and the whole world. So my view is that the CPTPP gives an excellent opportunity for Japan to engage in China more deeply, and also benefit the United States and EU from a long-term perspective. So from that perspective, I want to encourage the Japanese government to start consultation with China before officially starting CPTPP negotiation.
Okay.
My question to Professor Calder is that U.S. Official position, which is not very clear at this point. The U.S. can influence this policy through Canada and Mexico because the two countries are, bound by the clause embedded in the new NAFTA that the U.S. may have the right to withdraw from NAFTA if Canada and Mexico would do something that could damage the U.S. interest by agreeing on FTA with non-market economies, basically China. So to make it short, what would be the position of the United States towards CPTPP, and what would be the position in the EU towards China's accession towards CPTPP?
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Kawai. You've covered quite a lot of ground there. Let's put the second question first, then, on the CPTPP. Professor Calder first, if you would.
Okay, I guess the first point I would say is that people, our friends outside the United States, need to appreciate the ways that American policy today, and of course this began in the Trump years, the latter parts of the, well, even before Trump, but when Hillary Clinton, for example, backed out of supporting TPP, I guess I would date this to about 2015, but it's gained tremendous momentum, of course, throughout the Trump administration with all of the tariffs and withdrawal from TPP and so on. And then the Biden administration, surprisingly, did not move us back to a more liberal set of policies as I think a lot of people would have supposed. And here in Washington, of course, we're right in the following day of the defeat of the Democratic candidate for governor of Virginia, which right next door to Washington. So it had a particular shock. Populism on both sides, in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, has grown very strong. I don't think, particularly in the case of, the candidate who won in Virginia, that's true. I mean, he's an internationalist. He's a former senior executive of the Carlyle Group. But broadly, American politics is deeply intruded and trade policy, the pressures on trade policy by politics. It looks very likely, to my mind, that the Democrats will probably lose both houses of Congress in the 2022 election. And the prospects of the Biden administration are clouded, looking to the future. So I think that's the first point about trade policy, that it's very, very deeply influenced by politics. You indicate an interesting point, the idea that US policy might perhaps, to take CPTPP that Anthony suggested we take first. At an abstract level, I think most economists would welcome this sort of openness on the part of China to at least negotiate. It would have major geopolitical implications, and how would it affect the outcome of the actual negotiations themselves? From an American point of view, I think certainly our multinationals would be a bit skeptical, because they would feel that in many of the areas of most importance, in the service economy, in maybe in some of the areas most important to the United States, that including China would create a very different sort of an agreement, both economically and geopolitically, that would be not advantageous. So, of course, the issue, as also on the other question that you mentioned, is becoming more indirect. I think it's very interesting that Taiwan proposes now to join CPTPP. And I think there is a strong feeling on Capitol Hill in particular that, okay, if Taiwan applies and China applies, and then maybe if they're both admitted, then that would be an acceptable sort of a statement. But letting China in unilaterally without and letting them deny Taiwan a presence, I think in much of American politics, and probably even in the administration, it'd be an issue that they wouldn't be enthusiastic about.
Okay, just before you leave that issue, what about Professor Kawai's point that Japan and China should coordinate or talk more closely on the CPTPP before the negotiations get underway?
Well, I think it sounds from an economic point of view as a reasonable idea. The one thing I would add is that in many of the areas that I suppose must be subjects of Sino-Japanese trade, there are sectors, I mentioned too, 5G, AI, just being among them, but there's more and more sectors where defense technology is coming closer and closer to civilian. And so trade integration can come to have broader strategic implications. And those are the things I think the United States is becoming increasingly concerned about. And that's one of the reasons that I'm less optimistic about the stable triangle idea.
Okay, just
so very, very interesting. And to Professor Kawai's point, I'm not an academic expert on the details and the fine points of the EU China agreement there, but I think that why America takes a different approach there is because it's a little soft on the issues that America really cares about deeply. And America, for all intents and purposes, cares, about a lot of things with China. But from an economic perspective, the first one is the state-owned enterprises. That you do have unfair competition, and that the EU-China trade agreement is a little soft on that. They mention it, but I guess from an American perspective, it's a little bit too soft. Apart from state-owned enterprises, the second issue is intellectual property. Where again, America takes a slightly more aggressive approach, than the European Union. And then I guess the final point is the one that Professor Calder just mentioned. Obviously, what are the boundaries of national security? You can say, fine, it should be, today it's G5, tomorrow it's something else. I can tell you, for example, here in Japan, we last year we had a new foreign exchange and foreign investment law taking into effect, and supposedly to protect national security and national interest. If you look at the list of the companies who are protected, one of them is Unicharm, which makes diapers. I guess diapers are in the national interest. Anyway, so the point I think is a pretty clear one. I think on the CPTPP, right? What is interesting is that, wow, I mean, this is like a perfectly designed, strategic game. Remember, Professor Calder, we used to play these games, these strategic games at SAIS, right? And here you've got, I mean, this is perfect. You've got, Taiwan applying. You've got the People's Republic of China applying. And then when I talk to my Japanese friends in diplomatic circles here, they're really happy that now the UK has applied because they think that maybe that provides an exit, because if the standard for new admission, right, is set so high to get the UK in, right, that then neither Taiwan nor China can meet those criteria. That's sort of a potential sort of, diplomatic way out of what's going on. I do think, however, it's very likely that at some point over the next 12, 18 months, that I would not rule out a EU application, right, to actually join this as well. Really? Yeah, just watch for. I mean, we obviously have got the French elections in this late spring next year. Once it becomes clear that France actually does have a government, we could very well see this.
That's a very interesting point. If I can just add a brief question, there is how much leverage all this gives to the alliance partner, should we say, the US, possibly Europe, Japan, to not change China, but to demand that China makes the kind of changes in its economy that you've been talking about, or will China make major concessions on this point, or if indeed the conditions for entering the TPP are too stringent, will it simply walk away and say, well, sorry, but this is just an interference with our internal affairs and we have RCEP instead? Professor Calder.
Well, that of course is a very interesting question. Lately in Washington, there's increasing attention to the timeline, to trajectories, and to demographic change. In the short run, be it maybe 3 to 7 years, China, I mean, an awfully lot of people are thinking that way, and a contrary view is emerging, but feel that, China, of course, it will continue to grow. Relatively speaking, its military will get stronger. Whether it can really succeed in advanced technology without a dynamic market system. Some people would wonder if a socialist approach, command economy, is adequate in those advanced sectors of the economy. But the challenge of China to 2027 or to 2030 will be strong. I guess that sort of view is quite strong, but thereafter that it will begin to wane because of demography, lower labor forces, more and more rigidification in different sectors. So relating that to the leverage question, US leverage, China does have a lot of leverage globally at present, and it may even continue to rise, but it also will peak. And what kind of leverage, you might ask? Many people, and of course in the Biden administration, Jesper alluded to this point, I think it does have an extraordinary team that is more knowledgeable and more focused on Asia in the macro sense, in the Indo-Pacific sense particularly, than anything on the European side. And some colleagues in Washington are also worried that transatlantic relations are not getting the attention that they will get, and that will come back to bite the United States. But the US leverage, I think, is on the seas. It's in the Indian Ocean. It's on the choke points, things like the Strait of Malacca. It's beyond the South China Sea. So it may well be that China has the ability to heat up tensions this side of Singapore, but it's become so dependent on the broader world via the seas uh, in the last 2 decades that is creating a significant check. And I think that's what lies in terms of grand strategy, partly behind the AUKUS agreement. To my mind, it's too oriented toward the military and too narrow in some ways. But of course, that speaks exactly to the question of the dominance of the undersea lanes across the Indian Ocean and toward Europe.
Okay, thank you. Jesper,
No, and I'm glad that you bring up AUKUS, you know,
Professor
because I mean, again, you know, the on the military side, I mean, obviously the fundamental difference is that, you know, I mean, Europe is NATO, right? You know, where, you know, there's you know, decisions by committee, as it were, while this is not the case here in Asia Pacific. It's very clear who is boss. Right, it's the Seventh Fleet, and you know, I very much doubt that that America, you know, is going to give up that position.
Okay, Professor Kawai, did you want to just make any brief comment?
Yes. Well, containing China from a military and security perspective is a necessary thing at this moment. So I have no question about you know, security direction. Japan should be more you know, should be upright against China on the Senkaku issue, South China Sea issue, and Taiwan. No question. But on the other hand, we want China to change, perhaps starting from economic perspective, and Xi Jinping cannot remain in power forever. So at some point in the future, Xi Jinping will be gone, and China may be more ready to address its own domestic economic structural issues to sustain economic growth. I agree with Professor Calder that the socialist arrangement, the current kind of move towards state capitalism, would not be able to sustain long-term economic growth. So China has to change. So that's why this EU-China investment agreement is very important, because that includes the IPR issues and some aspect of SOE issues and labor standard issues. The coverage is you know, more limited than CPTPP, but nonetheless, it's a starting point. And CPTPP does address SOE reform, various aspects of China's domestic economic structural issues. So that's why, you know, I'm raising this issue. We have to take a look at China from a longer term perspective also, because China's advantage is that it can take a long-term perspective, but Xi Jinping seems to be taking a, you know, too short sighted kind of strategy. But we want to you know, interact with China from a longer term perspective.
Okay,
So any reaction is welcome.
thank you.
If I might just say one or two words, I think many of us know really brilliant market-oriented economists in China, and many of China's managers, even in high-level positions, would, I'm sure, subscribe to the things that you're saying. And from an economic point of view, in the long run, no doubt that would be good for the world. Whether that's possible, you know, question of the relationship to political realities, it seems to me, is the key question, and how that evolves in China.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from Yoda-san? You have a question, please. If you identify yourself and ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Calder and Mr. Koll. My name is Seishi Yoda, a member of the FCCJ. The Japanese politicians, in particular LDP, say there is no question the United States of America is the most important country to Japan in security. But China is also important, most important in import, export, Japanese trade to survive. I, as an average Japanese in senior age, understand this as a word. But when, and I'd like to ask what will be a serious conflict beside Taiwan will occur, how Japan can keep an appropriate or right balance between two countries. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Calder first, would you like to have a crack at that one, how Japan can...
Just briefly, well, I think it probably would be difficult. I think we haven't touched on, and I don't particularly want to, I mean, it's an issue that would consume our entire, many discussions, get into the, the transformation of security structure and what that might imply. Maybe let me finesse the question by saying, I think regardless of how relations with China evolve, and, I personally support much of what, Jesper hasn't put a political point on it, but he stressed the dynamism of the market and the deep ties that have emerged with China in the business sector. And those are, I think, inevitable and largely good. But I think what I would say in terms of whether it's a matter of a balance or it's where Japan needs to put its bets, even on areas that exist beyond security, to think about the strengths of the United States in the long run. I think we've seen these dramatically in the last decade in energy. We are now one of the largest energy exporters in the world as a result of tremendous innovation in natural gas, particularly. Also, of course, in food supply. And again, innovation has been a major element of this. I mean, China, just by virtue of this difference in the populations of the two, they give strengths and weaknesses to both sides. The Chinese have, for what would it be? Probably more than five times the population. No, let's see, 350. So maybe 4 times the population of the United States, roughly speaking. But conversely, 4 times the demand for energy, 4 times the demand for food in a world that will need those things. Also in technology, and this is to Professor Kawai's point, does the Chinese system of state-owned enterprises, is it capable of commanding the heights of technology compared to a globalized, market-oriented, private sector-driven system? I think the underlying strengths of the United States and also Europe are very considerable, even if you don't begin to think about demographics. And the United States will have its wind at its back demographically, whereas China's population will be aging more rapidly.
Okay. Professor Calder, I wholeheartedly, agree with you, and I certainly want to agree with you. unfortunately, just to make the counter argument, yes, there's tremendous strengths in terms of innovation and all of that wonderful stuff. Tremendous strengths in particular, maybe beyond innovation, commercialization. I mean, that's really what America excels at. However, the stress and strain on the social fabric, from the fact that, the top 1% now own basically 2/3 of all of America, the growing political tensions in American society because of this, gap between the rich and the poor and the lack of opportunity, for the poor to actually achieve a middle class. I mean, again, if I just look at the data, the economic system in the People's Republic of China, I don't like it. But if I just look at the data, it does generate some pretty impressive results in terms of poverty elevation, in terms of giving opportunity to the younger generation, in terms of educational achievement, in terms of healthcare achievements, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to, because obviously, to the question's point, right? What should Japan do? I mean, I think, and this is just my personal opinion. I'm not a security expert, right? But I mean, if there is war, right, then it's very clear, it's very easy. Japan is going to side with the United States. I think the much more complicated issue is if something like what we've seen over the last couple of years happening in Hong Kong, right, occurs, right? And America continues to be strategically ambiguous, right? But doesn't actually rise, to the defense of Taiwan over and above some high-minded statements, et cetera, right? Then what is Japan going to do? Is Japan going to be the defender of freedom and democracy? I think you and I would agree on what the answer is going to be. Right?
We agree profoundly in terms of the value aspect of that. The U.S. system desperately needs reform. It's terribly unequal. I do think China is also terribly unequal. Recently, the revolution itself and the aftermath, of course, tremendous hardship and so on, suffering. But nevertheless, China, as it began its growth process, was much, much, much more equal. And until maybe the last decade, it remained remarkably equal. I agree. I agree on that point. But so both sides need to undertake some change. What should Japan do? I probably would agree with what you say, and maybe leaving the question. I think it's one for our Japanese colleagues as well. If we do get situations like Hong Kong, if we get developments in Southeast Asia, where Japan has significant interests. Personally, I hope Japan will play, it has much greater incentive to play a proactive role. I hope that you're right, and maybe the private sector will push Japanese foreign policy to be more active in places like Southeast Asia in assuring that the kind of transformation we got in Hong Kong, which still is inside China itself, doesn't spread across the region.
Okay, just one closing question quickly, because we're running up against time, which is coming back to the theme of this talk, which is, Japan as the man in the middle. Business executives at the senior level have some very difficult decisions to make, presumably, not only because of the competition between the US and China, but also we've talked about the CPP. China may join, may not join. We have RCEP coming into play. So if you're a business leader, how do you shape your investment strategy in the light of all these conflicting factors? Is it going to create a very difficult situation or not? Professor Calder first.
Well, I think diversification might well be, and I'll defer to Jesper, he's closer to the business side, but I would say that. I think diversification, some significant activities on both sides, and with Southeast Asia probably as a promising area where Japan has market shares, it has prominence, it has geopolitical leverage. So stressing those kind of things, that would be basically what I would say.
Okay.
I think actually for Japanese business leaders, they've actually got it pretty figured out, and I don't want to be glib or nonchalant about it, right? But as I pointed out at the very beginning, I mean, there's a significant diversification that has already happened, and interestingly, if you go beyond, the whole, size of market access area, which is part of these trade agreements there, right? Ultimately, the single biggest challenge for corporate leaders in Japan is to procure top talent. Right? Where do the innovators, where does top talent actually come from? And it's very interesting because from that perspective, right? China just simply doesn't feature. Right? I mean, top talent does not want to study at Beijing University or at a Chinese technical college. They want to study in the United States of America. That's if you're Hitachi, if you're Toshiba, where are you procuring your top engineers, right? You're not going to China. You're going to the United States and, you're going to India. That's, I think, very, very clear. So from that perspective, I think, that's, the single biggest strength that the United States actually offers, right, for Japanese business leaders is the fact that top talent, top creativity is actually being procured, and that's an enormously positive stabilizing influencer that you have.
Okay, thank you. And if you want the best talent, presumably you go to Johns Hopkins University. Okay, well, we're right up against time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Calder, for joining us from the other side of the world. Thank you, Jesper, for joining us from the other side of the table. And also thank you, Professor Kawai, for being, in effect, a sort of third panelist. It's been an interesting discussion. I think whenever one starts this kind of discussion, you realize it needs 5 hours rather than 1 hour. But we'll come back to the theme. Deep dives will not leave it here. So, again, thank you very much. It's our custom, as you know, to give 1 year honorary memberships to our... I can't hear something.
Yeah. Well,
you will send.
I think, Anthony, I think you're kindly your colleagues have sent me something.
Oh, I see.
Which of course I'm delighted about. All I need to do is to get back into Japan now, which I look forward to doing.
I think
give you an incentive to get back to Japan.
Well, he's got lots of incentives, but he can't. So I think you should be fair to him and have the honorary membership start the moment Japan eases its entry rules.
That's an interesting thought.
Right?
Jesper, your membership is still valid, I think, yes?
Yeah, but I'm happy to, it's like a bond, right? You need to renew it all the time.
All right, well, we'll renew your bond then.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Professor Calder.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.